Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Precon Recon, where we take a look at the data behind pre-constructed commander decks to see what cards players are most commonly cutting from their precons, what cards are they adding, and what other future upgrades can you look forward to when you are upgrading your own list. This time we're taking a look at Millicent the Restless Revenant, a new spirits commander that is really aggressive. Azorius is normally known for being a little bit slow and methodical, but Millicent is a beating. It reduces its own cost for the more spirits you have, and it resupplies your own spirit army to make sure that you're always able to take your opponents down with an army of Geists. Let's start by getting to know Millicent's core cards from her precon. Some of the most important spirits here are the buff spirits, the ones that pump up the entire team, from Supreme Phantom to Drogskull Captain, and even Mirror Entity, which is a changeling. These are really fantastic ways to make sure that your spirits are going to be extremely powerful when they enter into combat, which this deck definitely wants to do very often. A lot of these spirits have flying after all, making them quite terrifying in the air. A lot of the spirits are also just really pesky to try and deal with. Rattlechains, for example, gives your spirits flash, and Remorseful Cleric is really annoying to any opponent of yours who might happen to be playing graveyards. Some cards that happen to incidentally be spirits, like Windborn Muse, will also really pester our opponents, and some stuff like Hanged Executioner will fill up our field while also threatening to exile some of their creatures. I'm also definitely a fan of Breath of the Sleepless, which gives our stuff flash and helps tap down enemy creatures to keep their board more under control so that we can attack them more easily. And Shacklegeist can keep really annoying things tapped down in case you need them not to attack you or not to block you. We also, of course, have to shout out Geist of Saint Traft, a fan favorite and one of the cooler spirits to ever be printed. Even though the token it makes is an angel, this spirit is way too fun not to join the party. Speaking of angels, there are a few here that help out the deck with recursion. Angel of Flight Alabaster isn't a spirit, but it does get them back from the graveyard for us. And Karmic Guide is an angel spirit that can get our stuff right back into play and will sacrifice itself, which can actually proc Millicent's ability. And if we need even more recursion, the new spell Storm of Souls will bring all of our dead creatures right back out and turn them into spirits. Granted, they are 1/1 spirits, but they do have flying, and a whole bunch of the ones that we saw earlier do pump all of our spirits up, so that might not be that much of a drawback after all. However, I think the most important part of this deck is how it keeps up on card advantage. Sire of the Storm and Bygone Bishop are both spirits that can help us find more cards, but when we're filling up the board with a whole bunch of creatures, we might run out of cards in our hand really quickly, so Distant Melody is clutch, and so are effects like Reconnaissance Mission. All of our creatures have flying, so it makes them really easy to go in and peck our opponents, which will definitely help us keep up on those cards. If we're playing a slightly aggressive strategy, keeping up on the card draw is going to be really crucial to make sure that a single board wipe never takes us out of the game completely. So these card draw effects are super important to keep in mind. So, okay, we've gotten to know some of Millicent's favorite cards from her precon, but what cards aren't making the cut? What are the cards from the precon that you kind of need to yank out to make room for other cooler improvements down the line? Well, first of all, there's a card here that I am surprised to see in the precon because it feels really out of place. That's Dovin Grand Arbiter. I guess having a board full of evasive creatures will help him accrue a whole bunch of loyalty, but even then, I don't think he's necessarily worth it here, and I think he kind of distracts us from the thing that we actually want to do, which is just to get a whole bunch more spirits. And speaking of, there are a bunch of non-spirit creatures that players do not seem to be really fond of from this precon. Boreas Charger, Knight of the White Orchid, Mentor of the Meek, these might look decent in theory, but they are all kind of unnecessary. We'll hit our land drops reliably enough if we're able to draw a bunch of cards, and Mentor of the Meek is not a great draw effect compared to the things that blue could offer us instead. And most of all, these just aren't spirits, so again, they're a little bit of a distraction. The popularity of these cards for Millicent is pretty wavering so far. Some of these effects certainly can be powerful, but since they aren't spirits themselves, it doesn't seem to be a great sell for players who want to make this deck as aggro as possible. And even some actual spirits aren't making the cut too, like Custody Squire and Kami of the Crescent Moon, whose abilities are unreliable and can even give stuff away to our opponents, which we don't necessarily have the patience for. In addition to this, Rhoda and Timon, the secondary commanders from this deck, aren't sticking around very often either, and as a result, the card Verity Circle from the precon, which really seems to synergize with those commanders' ability, is also getting removed from a whole bunch of these lists. These commanders present an interesting tap dance deck of their own, but they really aren't fitting in with Millicent's overall game plan. I also want to remark upon two mana rocks that players are cutting from the precon. Midnight Clock and Azorius Locket are getting cut out of a huge percentage of the precon decks, but The Midnight Clock, I actually personally want to push back against a little bit. I would recommend trying this one out a bit more. Millicent can commit a whole bunch of creatures to the battlefield, which means you might run out of cards in hand really quickly, and I think that having a big refill like this will come in real handy when you're playing a deck that is this punchy and this susceptible to board wipes. And lastly, there's a small miscellaneous slew of cards that players are cutting out of this deck. Fell the Mighty, Disorder in the Court, Haunting Imitation, and Sudden Salvation all have better options out there for the effects that they could provide. These all look like easy cuts to make way for more interesting fare down the line. So let's get to that now. Let's talk about the cards that players are adding to their deck and making their spirit bombs even more powerful. The very first thing that we see players doing is adding even more spirit buffs to their deck. Empyrean Eagle is a bird spirit, Patrician Geist is an awesome pump, Catilda is a very beefy creature, and Drogskull Reinforcements is pretty dang cool. The latter two of these are being added to 45% of decks so far, and the first two are being added to over 70% of decks. And I think these are great ways to turn a huge board full of 1/1 spirits into a huge board of 2/2 spirits or 3/3 spirits, and totally clobber your opponents for a whole bunch of damage. Once again, I cannot stress enough, this is a really punchy deck. I don't think your opponents will expect this much firepower coming out of blue and white, which are traditionally associated as being slower colors, but man, these can get really powerful, and these cards definitely help out with that. But whenever you've got a big army full of buff creatures, that also means you've got to protect them, which is why 77% of players are adding in Selfless Spirit to their Millicent deck. 67% of players are adding in Kira Great Glass Spinner, along with 43% including Unsettled Mariner. These cards can protect a board from a wipe or give your stuff hexproof / a pseudo shroud to make sure that your stuff remains untargetable and unremoved. I also really like to see that players are including Guardian of Faith and Spectral Adversary to help phase out creatures as necessary. Phasing also protects our tokens, which is really clutch to make sure that we protect our Army of the Dead. And by the way, I gotta say, these cards are especially nasty to cast in response to an enemy's Cyclonic Rift. Sometimes our forms of protection can also get a little bit counterspelly, which is why we're seeing over half of players include Spell Queller into the deck, and over 2/3 of players including Mausoleum Wanderer. Both of these can help protect our board not by phasing our stuff out or giving it indestructible, but just by countering some spells. Mausoleum Wanderer starts off pretty small, but with enough buffs, we might be able to make it a really reasonable counterspell effect that our opponents cannot pay out of. And as if there wasn't enough nuisance in the Precon already, Skyclave Apparition and Nibelgast Herald are also getting added to a good chunk of decks there too. Some of these cards, like the Skyclave Apparition, might be a little bit on the expensive side, but they can be very effective tools to make sure that your opponent's best stuff never bothers you. Easily the most expensive cards that are getting added to this deck, however, are the enchantments. 47% of Millicent decks so far contain Smothering Tithe, and 44% contain Anointed Procession. These cards are fantastic, especially when working in tandem with one another. But as always, play within your budget. Millicent doesn't need super expensive cards to help her bash face. I mean, heck, Talisman of Progress is currently sitting at above $10 for a simple mana rock, and plenty of players are adding that in here too, but you'll also be perfectly fine with a Mind Stone, the next most popular mana rock that we're seeing players add to this deck. Players are rounding out this deck's removal suite with a Path to Exile too, but even that one can be a couple of dollars sometimes. These are the cards we're seeing players add so far, but there are definitely budget replacements available. In fact, two of my favorite cards getting added to this deck are very cheap indeed. Mirror Hall Mimic and Clarion Spirit are both really cool token makers. The back half of Mirror Hall Mimic is also just really cool, a sort of Followed Footsteps-esque effect that also makes the card a spirit. These are super neat cards, and I can't recommend them enough for this deck to help flesh out the battlefield in very subtle but eventually very powerful ways. And finally, the card draw effects that we're seeing players add to this Precon include cards like Bident of Thassa, Skullclamp, and the new Cemetery Illuminator, which doesn't provide card draw necessarily, but does provide advantage off the top of your library, not to mention some incidental graveyard hate. These are neat to see, but in fact, I would wager that we want to go even harder on the card draw for this deck. We really don't like running out of cards in hand. We always want to keep casting more and more of our cheap spirits so that we can attack our enemies and draw more cards and play more spirits that attack our enemies and draw even more cards and so on. You'll never go wrong with adding even more card draw to this deck. In Precon Recon, I always like to take a look at the swaps that players are making to the deck's mana base as well to see what cool things might be happening there, and if there are any duds in the original Precon's mana base that players are getting rid of in exchange for some cooler cards down the line. In this case, we actually only have like one swap each direction of note. Temple of the False God and Deserted Beach are the only cards that we're seeing players cut from the Precon in the case of Temple and add to the Precon in the case of the Beach. So far, players seem pretty satisfied with the original Precon's mana construction. No need to be fancy about it, we just need to get some flyers into play so that they can start attacking right away. Alright, so that's what the data is so far showing us that players are cutting from the Precon and adding to the Precon, but what if you want to go even further? What are some future upgrades that you can make to this deck that we haven't yet seen crop up in the data? Well, Drogskull Reaver only shows up in 28% of Millicent decks so far, and I think that's really low. In fact, Drogskull Cavalry also only shows up in 17%. I know that these have high mana costs, but they have huge payoffs too. I really hope that the popularity of these cards for Millicent gets a whole lot bigger, because they are really spicy for this deck. The next most important thing to look into is definitely going to be further pump up effects. Celestial Crusader, Cathar's Crusade, Radiant Destiny, and maybe even a favorable Winds, I think are all worth looking into. Celestial Crusader in particular because it is also a spirit that will pump up basically all of our tokens. Really, there's a lot to recommend about all of these. We make so many tokens that Cathar's Crusade I think will go a little bit bonkers, and Radiant Destiny giving our spirits vigilance is really important to have flying defenders. That's not all in terms of pump though. If you want to splurge even further, Door of Destinies and Vanquisher's Banner are classic tribal payoff cards. They can be a little bit expensive though. So honestly, when it comes to artifacts that can help out this deck, I really like looking at some mana rocks to help it out. Heraldic Banner, naming white can pump up all of our spirits. And if we have a whole bunch of flying evasive little creatures in the air, Strixhaven Stadium looks even better as a mana rock. Even if we don't have all of our pump-up effects in play, this card still makes all of our spirits properly frightening. I'd also be remiss if I didn't shout out one of my favorite tribal payoff cards ever, Reflections of Lityara. Copying up our spirits is so dang good. I've used this in 2 different tribal decks so far, and it has paid off hugely in dividends, and I see no reason it won't do just as much work here. A really interesting card that I think might be useful for this deck is Court of Grace, which introduces the Monarchy to the game, which is really nice for a deck with a whole bunch of evasive creatures. And it makes angel tokens as long as you hold on to the Monarchy, but it makes spirit tokens if you don't happen to hold on to the Monarchy. I feel like this could be pretty useful. Either we get big angels to fly in and attack our opponents and keep the Monarchy around and draw extra cards, or we get a spirit, which we know that our deck will love and will have a whole bunch of tribal payoffs for. This is pretty interesting. Give this one a shot. And in fact, don't be afraid to customize the removal in this deck towards your spirit army as well. Perplexing Test is a really fascinating card that can either remove all tokens or remove all non-tokens, and this can be really effective when we have a huge army in the air. And March of Souls gets rid of a bunch of creatures and replaces them with spirits. And Millicent also will replace our cards with even more spirits. And basically Millicent will cost next to no mana to cast after we play a spell like this. Customizing board wipes in an EDH deck can be extraordinarily deadly, and these are fun options for exactly that effect. And lastly, I mentioned them earlier, but card draw effects are very important for this deck. If the Bident of Thassa and Reconnaissance mission effects weren't enough for you, I definitely recommend looking into Coastal Piracy, which is, unfortunately, a little bit expensive these days, but there is a very budget-friendly version, Curiosity Crafter, from a recent Strixhaven Precon, and that could be fun to look into too, since it also has flying. In fact, since so many of the cards in this deck are flying, I highly recommend adding in Winged Words. It's a small amount, but 2 mana to draw 2 cards is really efficient, and in fact, Charticores could be just as effective for the exact same reasons. And lastly, if you're a fan of the card Distant Melody in this deck, maybe also take a look at Ribbons of the Raikai. Draw a card for every spirit we control? Don't mind if I do. This might draw us just a few cards, say after a board wipe when Millicent has supplied us with only 2 or 3 tokens left over, but it also might draw us like 10 cards, and we will never be sorry to see more cards in our hand. We've got Spirit, yes we do. So those are the changes that we're seeing players most commonly make to the new Spirits Precon. But what do you think? Are there cards that players are cutting from the deck that you think should be kept? Or any other cards that you would recommend adding to make the deck even stronger? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you on the next Precon Recon.